I have been working in a thrift store for a few years, and I've seen it all. Old clothes, old furniture, bugingas that no one knows for what they serve. But nothing could prepare for what I found in that donation box. It was a ballot box, but not a common ballot box. She was all ornate, with silver details that seemed to shine even in the weak light of the store. There was something about her that caught my attention, something I couldn't explain. I decided to take her home, perhaps to use it as a decoration or just to satisfy my curiosity. As soon as I knew that decision was going to change everything. That night, at home, I heard something, a low whisper, like nails scratching wood from all sides. I tried to ignore it, but the air suddenly sprinkled, even with the warming on. A cold that looked alive, following my steps. I looked at the ballot box, quiet in the corner of the room, and my stomach turned. It started when she arrived. I didn't sleep that night. The whispers came back, now with an urgent tone, words that I did not decipher. The cold grew, bringing a slight smell of smoke that made me cough. I got up, but the windows were closed, the warming on. There was no explanation. It was as if something stuck in the ballot is waking up, calling me. The next day, I decided to investigate the origin of the ballot box. I returned to the thrift store and asked about the donation box. The owner of the place, an elderly lady, said she did not remember who had left that box, but thought she came from a house that was being emptied after a tragedy. She didn't give much detail, but the way he said it made me even more intrigued. I went home with a knot in my throat and could barely look at the ballot box without feeling a chill. That thing was there, quiet, but it seemed to be throbbing with an energy that I couldn't ignore. It was then that I decided to search the internet, trying to find some clue about the family that could have had that ballot box. After a few hours by running down on the internet, I found ancient news about a family that had died in a fire for over 50 years. Their house was in the same region where the thrift store was located, and the description of some of the burnt objects hit the ballot box I had at home. The article mentioned that the bodies were never found, and that the family never had a decent burial. I got a weight in my chest as I read that, as if invading something that shouldn't. But at the same time, I felt that I needed to find out more. The ballot box was not just an old object. She had a story, and that story seemed to be pulling me inside. That night, the whispers returned, but this time they were lighter. I could distinguish a few words: help, fire. We couldn't get out. It was as if someone was trying to tell me what had happened, but I couldn't understand everything. The cold was unbearable, and I found myself covering with blankets even indoors. I even turned on the heater at most, but it was no use. It was then that I noticed something strange. The ballot box was slightly open, as if someone had moved her. I was sure it had closed it right before leaving home. My heart accelerated, and I felt a fear that I had never felt before. Someone or something was there with me. I could no longer ignore what was happening. I decided I needed to do something, but I didn't know what. The idea of throwing the ballot box out crossed my head, but something inside me said it would only make things worse. It was as if the ballot box was attached to me or I me. So I decided to try to communicate, somehow. I stayed in front of the ballot box and asked aloud, "What do you want?" The answer came almost immediately. The cold increased suddenly, and the whispers became higher, almost shouting. I could hear clearly now, "Sepultura, we need peace." It was scary, but at the same time, I felt a tip of relief. At least now I knew what to do. The next day, I went to a local cemetery and explained the situation to the gravedigger. He looked at me like I'm crazy, but when I described the ballot box and family history, he was serious. He said he knew the story and that family never had a decent rest. He offered to help bury the ballot box in a symbolic tomb, but warned that I needed to say goodbye to that energy, otherwise she would keep following me. I returned home with a mixture of fear and hope, but barely I knew the worst was yet to come. That night, I prepared everything for the funeral the next day. I put the ballot box in a bag and left near the door, but something made me hesitate. It was like I'm about to make a mistake, as if there was something I still had to do. It was then that the whispers returned, but this time they were different. They were calmer, almost like an apology. The cold also diminished, and I felt a strange sense of relief. I thought maybe they were finally found peace, but I was wrong. In the middle of the night, I woke up with a noise from the room. It was as if someone was dragging something heavy on the floor. My heart shot, and I knew I couldn't simply ignore it. I arrived in the living room and the ballot box was in the center, open, shaking as if live. The air was dense, smelling of ashes that suffocated me. Dark shadows raised from her burnt figures, with white eyes staring at me, hands stretched asking for something. Then a voice cut the silence. "Thank you." It was soft, but it echoed in my bones. I shouted, "Can you go now?" And a cold wind exploded through the apartment, taking the shadows and the weight that choked me. The ballot box stopped empty, but the echo of that voice was. The next day, I buried the ballot box in the cemetery as combined. The gravedigger made a small ceremony, and I felt relieved, but at the same time, there was still a strange feeling inside me. It was as if part of that energy was still with me, as if I had carried a little of that story forever. I returned home and, for the first time in days, the apartment was silent. There were no more whispers, no cold points, nor that feeling of being observed. But something inside me knew that this experience was not really ended. The ballot box is buried, and silence has come back. But last week, in the thrift store, I saw another one between the donations, identical, shining in the weak light. I didn't touch her. Still, sometimes, in the dark, I feel a shiver and I hear a whisper that I don't know if it's theirs or mine.